Our vision is entirely about making compliance really a big part of the business that makes it just easier for everybody to be compliant instead of having these as like after the fact that you've done this, after the fact that you created something, whereas like compliance is sitting in the role of actually leading how you should be turning left and right. Like business is the speed and direction, but then some directions are just not allowed.
Well, thanks everyone for joining us. This is Bo Howell from FinTech Law. Today I'm here with Mamal Amini from Govern GPT, an AI compliance tool focused on the financial services industry. Mamal, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So I'd love to hear a little bit about your background. You know, AI is a hot topic. Myself, I don't know a lot of AI developers. I'm sure a lot of our listeners don't either. So tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into machine learning.
I've been a machine learning scientist and used to publish papers and patents in research organizations like Mila, corporate and startups that have raised a lot of money, $1 billion, the most recent one that I worked at. Tried to apply this to different settings. Some were just purely research, like applications of it to chip design or drug discovery. And some were more commercial and actually getting it in the hands of people in the insurance. And for the last year and a couple months, I've been in the compliance space. I've talked to a lot of compliance folk to actually apply this relatively to the work they need.
How did you make that transition, right? You're kind of in a more academic, research-oriented. I know a lot of times with fintech founders, right? Like we go out and look for the problem, right? We find the problem that we want to solve it. How did you find this problem? Is there kind of like a story behind that?
It was almost the same setup. It's just my ex-co-founder was a lawyer and I knew a few people in banking that they told me you should look into compliance.
Okay.
Because it's just inundated with very weird softwares that are not the best. So I just looked into it and talked to a lot of compliance folk, chief compliance officers, compliance managers, just talked to them about their day-to-day operations, where they would see the biggest pain points. Pretty much just build 2 products before, put it in the hands of some CCOs in Canada, killed those, and we iterated from that to the current product that we have.
Yeah, when I started my first fintech company a few years ago, we were focused more on process automation at the time. And I remember saying, look, compliance tools aren't going to be really valuable to advisors and broker dealers until the machine learning part of it becomes, mature enough. Because at the end of the day, what I found was, people like the idea of technology and a tool, but what they really wanted was someone to do it for them. And it needed to either be a person or a machine, right? So, and that was a few years ago. And it seems like we've made a lot of advancements just in that short period of time. And now AI is kind of the craze in the industry. So what's your take on AI in financial services? I mean, we hear a lot about products and stuff out there. Is a lot of it smoke and mirrors? Do you think a lot of it's like, hey, this is kind of real and it's very valuable? Or do people have to be kind of cautious and picky about how they approach AI in our industry?
I think in some way it's underhyped and in some way it's overhyped at the same time. It's a little weird. I would say some people are just incredibly, critical about their operations, and then you don't want to hand it to AI. Whereas like some operations are less critical and it's very repeat feedback, repeat comments, repeat type of work. And I think people really don't understand what repeat means, because I think what people in the industry have been used to is like, oh, okay, like if this is not the lexicon based systems, then what is it? Then you're like, no, it understands semantics, it understands language as a whole. So it's still repeat if you look at it from that angle. I think what you really want is a company, if more than one process, they're probably not the right people to solve this for. I would just definitely say that. And I think you really want to focus on a process. Just a lot of it is happening. And that's one of the things that we looked for, a recurring theme. So volume is key for us to even commit to one process, because if you don't have volume, then you can't train the models. And without that, then you essentially walk away with just lower confidence in what the AI produces. That would be the key point. And you still want to augment the people who are using this AI tool. So at the end of the day, you can't fully delegate it. You can fully delegate very, very sub processes, and only then you can try to, automate sub processes as much as possible. I think some sub processes are just, again, menial tasks that really skilled lawyers do not want to do. That's my personal experience.
To translate for folks who are maybe not very technical, it sounds like what you're saying is, the machines are very good at conducting certain tasks, say looking at new regulations or combing kind of the web for new information. But it's good to have a human kind of on the back end to review and validate that information as it's coming in.
That's the first step for sure. That's one of the things we do, right? We do that first month of testing or a pilot phase where we are tuning it specifically for their context, within their business, within their style. Let's say if you're a lawyer, you still have your own style, you still have your own understanding of how to do things. And that's on an individual level, but there's also the firm level of like, what does this business need? How do I support this business as, the legal and compliance person in the business? So I think there's all those aspects. And then you really want to get the validation from that person. So if that person cares about it, they want to be able to have as much input into the AI. So you want to treat AI as a junior analyst that's just learning how to do the job and understands a few things really well and can work all the time, and you can create as many flows as you want. Its effectiveness is all about how you position it. It's really efficient, but it's not effective until you position it perfectly.
That's understandable. And I imagine too, just having kind of that human interaction in the development of the product, right, and the refinement of it, that probably helps get over trust issues, right? Because I can see when it comes to compliance, a lot of people are like, man, if I trust this machine and it makes a mistake, like that could have huge ramifications on my company, right? Just like, so, when they hire a chief compliance officer, they have to have a lot of trust in that person and their experience and their background, their knowledge. They have to have the same thing in the machine. So I would imagine that bringing in that, human element to the refinement process helps to establish some of that trust. I guess tell me a little bit about your company. You talked about firms out there in AI, they should really be focusing on a process or, becoming an expert, kind of going very deep, becoming a master of one area. Tell me a little bit about your firm, Govern GPT, and what it does.
So we help reviewers of marketing and sales materials to do their job just faster and save their time. Once we gain their trust, as you say, in the first month or two, depending on the firms, that the trust of the person who's reviewing or the team who's reviewing, then we put this in front of the sales and marketing folk who create the content. So they get that first round of reviews before it even comes to the compliance. So the first step is we save the time of compliance analysts or compliance officers who do the reviewing job. The reason we ended up there was, again, a lot of skilled lawyers or compliance professionals who don't really like to do marketing compliance as major chunk of their day. There's other things they would rather do. There's a lot of emotions involved in the very process we try to automate. We don't automate it fully. We automate certain parts of it, and I can get into the details of that. Because as I'm saying, like, you want to trust certain aspects of it, but you can't fully trust it. So you still want to let the machine do some of the heavy lifting, and then you do the other parts that's more innovative and that's more unique. We really wanted to touch on something that has this aspect of style, because that's what AI is really good at, is capturing the style of each individual, say in this case, reviewer. So getting that human style into, our AI and tuning it for them. So tuning it to the way Bo would review material versus Mamal would review material. That was one of the things we really wanted to do, rather than this linear way of thinking of, a lot of other AI applications, which is search application. Don't get me wrong, they're incredibly valuable, but this is one of the things we personally were just really interested in.
I know you like to kind of refer to yourself as like the Grammarly of compliance, right? And I know that Grammarly, which I love that tool. I've been using it for years. It allows you, especially at a business level, to set kind of a style guide, right? And set that up. And it sounds like you guys are doing the same thing from a compliance angle.
Let's say we work with a compliance manager and he's managing 3 people under him. Usually that manager tends to like one reviewer really so much, and we work with that person.
Don't tell the others.
Others are usually aware. They're probably just are not interested in this process, and they're like, okay,
sure.
It's just one person is tends to be really passionate about this, is really excited about this. So we tune our AI to be the baseline to emulate and clone that person's review. So then it gets in front of the people who create the content. That's why we call it Grammarly. It's not your Shakespeare in English per se, but it'll do the job just well enough so that you won't have most of the major mistakes. And then it comes to the reviewer for a final check.
Well, and let's be honest. I mean, a lot of marketing material, can get scrubbed down to the point where a lot of times can sound the same, right? It's because of the limitations of what you can say, even the verbiage you can use. It looks a little whitewashed across the industry. Tell us a little bit more about your product. I'd love to hear more, not only about how it works, but how did you develop it? I know one of the things that for folks who are kind of following AI, you always talk about like data sets, data protection, privacy, confidentiality. Can you hit on a few of those subjects?
Yeah, for sure. So our privacy policies on our website as well. For us, we don't really touch much on PIIs because of any personal information, essentially because of just the nature of marketing materials, nature of sales materials. I'm sure this is something that a lot of other AI companies have to deal with. In terms of security, every data that we deal with is just for each company, just because of the very nuanced case for each company at the end of the day. You have your business case, you have regulatory context, business goals. There's so much nuance around it that not only obviously we don't share it for security purposes, but also it doesn't even make sense AI-wise to do so. Our base model that we've developed is an AI that, is imagine your most conservative reviewer analyst. The point of it is just to show people that it understands your marketing materials. It understands how to review, but it doesn't understand how to review the way you do it. So then we have that 1 month process to tune it to their style. So we ask them, how do you do this? Would you like this? Let's look at your past reviews. Some people are very wanting to, just tune it to their style because they're like, oh yeah, I want the customization. Some don't. And I think the ones who don't are not really the people that we want to deal with today, mostly because we believe the biggest value add of actually this part of this type of automation comes from that customization. That's incredible customization of both modeling and the workflow.
A little bit of upfront effort from your ideal customer, right? Because you're training it the way they want it to be trained. It's not just like a pure plug and play. They can't just sign up, fill out a form in 5 minutes on your website and just start running data through it, right? So and I think that makes sense, right? I mean, a lot of the concern with AI, and you hear about it with like ChatGPT, right, is it can come up, fictionalize things. It can come up with stuff that's maybe not correct from a regulatory perspective. And so training the models in a way where it's very precise and very specific, not only to really the regulatory side, but also like you're saying on the style side, I think that's important. And it's also consistent with what you were mentioning, when this gets turned over to the marketing team, it's consistent with their expectations, right? If all of a sudden they've been kind of trained in a certain way by their compliance person to do certain things, and then you completely change those guidelines, that can be very disruptive to your marketing team. Not releasing it to them until the guidelines are built into the machine is, I think, a great move.
Then it would automatically get updated per se, or
Yep.
You got a disclaimer now, or you got a new award and now you want to advertise your new award. If you're a marketing or salesperson, sometimes you want to do it, but you don't know how to do it in the proper proper way. You just let me. So whereas if you're built it in the AI, then it gives that feedback immediately. So I think there's an aspect of also consistency of reviews. And the reason I think people care about consistency right now, I bet, is just because of the delayed feedback that you'd get. Because if you get that feedback as you're creating content, you probably have less attachment. And this is with few firms that we've gone to the stage of actually putting it in front of the salespeople, because we, as of now, with everybody we work with, we just save the time of compliance as of now. But with the people that we've gone there, it's just they're like, oh yeah, okay, I would rather have this than just a delayed reaction. And at the end of the day, you give me feedback on only one line rather than a lot of the pieces within the marketing materials that I created.
Right, and that's a good point. I mean, probably generally speaking, if a marketing person submits a new piece, I would assume most firms are like, hey, it's a 1 to 2 business day turnaround, right? They might get it to you faster. It just depends on the reviewer, what they have going on, their availability. For your machine, how fast does it turn it around?
If it's an email within a couple seconds, if it's a 60-page pitch deck, it's like a minute.
Wow.
And what you said is also true in terms of the reviewer, but also a lot of firms, they have a different priority of who gets the reviewer's priority, essentially.
Right.
So,
Okay.
if you're an advisor, say, if you're an RA, you have an advisors that are, they have a lot of AUM, so they get just more priority, and they're more senior, they're just more tenured. So obviously they just get prioritized. So their content gets reviewed fast, whereas if you're junior, your content doesn't necessarily get reviewed ASAP. So again, it's almost like that cycle, and that sort of goes around in terms of the experience aspect of it changes here.
With your product, I mean, how does it work? Is it a web-based product? Is it an application? Is it an add-on to an existing application? Like, talk a little bit more about how the users would interface with it.
So right now it's a web application, plus we have built extensions into Microsoft Word and Microsoft PowerPoint. And the extensions are only in front of the content creators. So in the first stage is only once we gain the trust of compliance, and it saves the compliance hours. In details, how it works is really dependent on the firms we work with. For some firms, it's about validating a DDQ and quarterly update. For some firms, the major point that they care about is making sure the language is not promissory, or we're adding the right disclosures, disclaimers, or we're checking for performance, whether it's hypothetical, it's a gross, net, standardized timescales. For some firms, it's actually cherry picking. The major part of that tuning process is also for us to pick just the top few is the biggest time saver for compliance folk. For some firms, they tell me like, oh yeah, if you just take care of the DDQ, validation part, that's like 60% of my time. I'm like, okay, cool. Let's start with there. Each feature to get tuned to, let's say, Bose style, it takes a bit of time. So once we tune that, then we deliver the other features in the meanwhile.
You brought up a couple of good points with like model performance, hypothetical performance. I know at least here in the United States, right, the new marketing rule for advisors came out about a year ago. It's been an area of focus for the examination and enforcement this year. It's going to continue to be an area of focus for the examination team at the SEC, because your product's been out for a while. How did you adjust the model to kind of adapt to the new rule?
We started with the new rule, actually.
Oh, okay.
One of the major reasons we even pivoted to this product and we started like pivoting our previous product to just kill the previous product to this was because of the new rule. The new rule came into effect November of last year, which is exactly around the time that I started speaking to a lot of compliance officers. But from day one, we went through the whole new rule. We have policy know-hows from a few law firms in the country that essentially serve the same clients we serve. So we first built with those know-hows that are made for, say, RIAs, BD, regulated by FINRA. But I think even right now, I heard that they're trying to harmonize this, the rules for when it comes to marketing and sales for both.
Sure.
Over the SEC. We built that as the base version of like, as we just went through, you check for cherry picking, check for gross and net, or the time scales. Is it hypothetical, targeted? Is it extracted? What's the track record? And that's when it comes to, let's say, specifically about performance. And then again, we go into details. So what we do is with AI, we create these guidelines and we get into details of these guidelines. So there is a high level of the language that's understanding the marketing rule, but then we create this massive tree. Maybe it's not tree necessarily, but it's like a tree of like, what are the triggers in terms of this document triggers? Is it advertising even in the first place? Is it, under the definition of advertisement, let's say with the SEC, right? And then again, like, what are the things that are discussed here? What's this type of document? Does this match with past standards of what was acceptable? Was there a template that you should respect? Product descriptions that you've written, are they accurate? And that's a big part of it. So like you check the descriptions from the users, what's available on Edgar, and in Canada it's CDAR, and other websites. It's like what's available on the websites to just check the availability of just the products that are available. Like what are they? Does it need any relevant policies around in terms of, let's say, language? And the reason I'm saying this is like PC or FDIC disclosures for suite products. Each type of product, they have their own disclosures. Those are inserted correctly. It goes further in terms of like, okay, like what about Advisors Act compliance? What's your, let's say, fiduciary duty? There's no fraud, no lying. Is it fair and balanced? Are you differentiating statements of fact? Does it need sources versus is it like statements of opinion? And the reason that matters is like, again, we're at this stage, we're not, let's say, doing the fact checking, only serving compliance as the major first point. I do see our product down the line to also do the fact checking, which is actually something that, marketing or IR does. Further, again, you'd have aspects like, oh, what are the investor statements and testimonials? Is it compensated or not? We put guidelines in terms of each aspect. And the way we look at it is really try to emulate the way a compliance officer looks at it. And when I'm saying that, people look at it very, very differently. So we ask people how people look at it. We have our own engineering mindset. So we try to engineer as much as possible into this process.
If it's, say, dealing with hypothetical or model performance in a fact sheet or some type of advertising piece. One part of the rule requirement is you have to have the data to support that. So would your tool just kind of alert the user, like it can't validate that data exists, right? But it would post like an alert, hey, make sure you have the data to validate this. It's saved to the system. It's part of your books and records. Is do that.
Pretty much, it's just like because that's what the compliance officers do. We don't know a single compliance officer that does the validation. What they do is like, do you have the sources? And they ask, do you have the sources? So we're emulating that review. Is the source right there? Then they usually do a trust basis, the compliance officers, as we know right now. It's just that they trust that this is the right source. And if there is no source, they're like, do you have the source for this? Please provide the source for this. That's what I'm saying. Like, down the line, we see that we would find the source ourselves and we would connect it to the database. But right now, we're that analysis layer to do the review.
So that's the feedback part from the human user, right? The human element is at some point the machine has to kind of stop, and it's dependent on you for either validation or confirmation that something exists outside of the database. Okay.
Yeah, you really want to work with the AI as if you're training a new analyst, and now you have this extra analyst at like a fraction of the price that just can work all the time. I think that's like never forgets your instructions, remembers your instructions very, very well.
Right. That's a good point.
There's consistency of that as well. So you're standardizing how the reviews are given.
Yep, I love it. One of the other things that the SEC here in the US has been focused on, and we see this right now in examinations, is kind of vendor due diligence. There are rule proposals out there that would require, certain levels of due diligence for RIAs. That can be challenging, particularly for a small RIA, right? Maybe somebody who doesn't have in-house technical staff. They themselves are not very technical, right? They're not machine scientists. If they need to do some type of reasonable amount of due diligence on a company like yours, what were the things you would recommend that they do part of their due diligence checklist?
They could ask questions, I think, around security. Like, for example, are we a keeper of records in line with the SEC rule of, I think it's 17A, or if I'm not wrong, is the data used to train a model? And okay, cool. Now, is that data being shared with everybody else, or is it just for myself? I think that's a question you want to have, which is, again, for us, like we have that in our security policies and privacy policies and in our SaaS agreement. You want to check where the servers, essentially, is the data being transferred. Let's say, well, for us, we have Canadian and American clients. So like Canadian clients, we use AWS in Canada, servers in Canada. For American clients, we use the AWS in the US. So it's like even to that level of detail you want to, I think, you could ask questions about that. Or you could ask what is returned, for what purpose, what's the purpose of the retainment, for how long are the AI providers retaining your data? And if you ask to remove it, will they remove it immediately? Or what's the timeline? So for us, for example, we have a 0-day retention policy. We go in the extremes. We're in the process of getting our SOC 2 compliance. So hopefully within the next couple of weeks, that should be finished. So I think like SOC 2 would probably be the best example. But if you're in a small RIA, and when I'm saying small, if you're probably under a couple billion AUM, probably you're in that small range. I wouldn't care about SOC 2, but I would care about these other questions that I just mentioned. We've been asked a lot about what's the difference between us and, let's say, some system of records like Red Oak, for example. We don't maintain records on behalf of the clients. This is a task that's suited for literally a dedicated system of records. We just provide regular experts of AI review comments for auditability, and so it's stored next to their published pieces of marketing content in their system of record, either as inline or in a separate bulk export. Those are essentially a lot of the questions I would ask around that aspect of it.
Do you think there's a requirement, or would you recommend that users ask questions around things like, kind of buzzwords you hear about AI, model drift, error rates, things like that? I mean, is that helpful for a product like this, or not really because of the way it's fine-tuned?
You do fine-tuning. We keep the model the same, and we do the testing if we change the models. I don't think it should matter so much. What you want to check, I would say, is can you communicate to the people who are essentially selling you whatever they're selling you as a service? And when I'm saying communicate, I mean the people who are actually building it, not to somebody who talks to somebody else. But if you're not talking directly to the person who's actually involved in the building process, and this happens all the time as companies grow, you have a customer success or you have a sales rep and you're dealing with that person. But the issue is like the sales rep or the customer success actually doesn't really understand your problem or your issue that you're complaining about. And by the time that goes to the engineer, It's just like there's already lost information. I would say, like, can you have direct line of communication to the person who's building it? Because then you'd be like, hey, I don't like this change that you guys made, or I feel like there's something that's changed, and please and fix it. And I would say that's what you want, because like if they're actually providing a service that valuable, I check for that line of communication with the people who are building it, and they're communicative and they're actually taking your feedback, because AI is so nuanced and it's like it's changing. So there is that aspect of, you know, uncertainty about it. That's why it matters more than, let's say, your typical SaaS solutions, where it's like pretty definitive.
So I imagine during the onboarding process, especially when you're fine tuning, there's a lot of that back and forth going on, right? Let's say it's a year or two down the road. Is your product such that you kind of wait for the user to reach out to you if they have any concerns or see any issues? Do you kind of schedule periodic check-ins or reviews with them? Talk a little bit about that.
First month, we schedule 2 hours a week.
Okay.
After that, we schedule half an hour every 2 weeks.
Wow. So, I mean, you're talking on at least a couple times a month, there's connectivity between your firm and the developers, the end users.
I want to build a big company. We want to build a big company. The only way you can build a big company is actually just get people's feedback. And most people, by and large, and that's not about using software, that's by and large my opinion about everybody, humans in general, we don't share everything. If something is wrong, we're just not comfortable sharing it until it becomes super critical. Whereas I don't want it to get to that level. I would rather like tell me, okay, well, you're not using this. Why are you not using it? What do you love about it? What do you hate about it? And really my model there is the CEO of Stripe, and he does it all the time. And he says, like, you want to hear painful comments from your customers every day, and you try to fix it. And I think that's something that people don't do in the software world within compliance.
When I had my fintech company, I mean, trying to get people to give feedback was like pulling teeth, right? I mean, nobody wanted to do it. Or, you know, people are nice, right? People don't want to hurt other people's feelings. So they're like, oh, this is great. I love it. No, it's fine. Everything works well. But then to your point, we can tell, okay, you're not using certain features, or maybe you're not using it all, right? And so it can't be great because you're not using it. And people don't like talking about that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, obviously you do have to provide that level of safety that like, look, I really want to learn. And this is like serving me that like you telling me, excuse my language, negative feedback and shit feedback, that's very useful for me. Like, I know you think it's gonna hurt my feelings, but like, and it might, but that's good. I'm seeking that. You definitely want that. And both me and Oliver, we actually attend in every one of those meetings ourselves. So like we're not like, oh, okay, let's hand it to one of our engineers. I plan to do this forever because I feel like, again, I believe the best founders, they've always done it like this.
Getting it straight from the source.
Yeah, and the users themselves, you know, like for us, it's like usually it tends to be that the chief compliance officer himself or herself doesn't use our product and is more the one that we show to part of the decision making. But the person who ends up usually using it is a compliance officer or, you know, compliance manager, director of compliance who works under the CCO, and maybe his or her team is actually using our product more often. So we need to have that direct line of communication. So with a firm, for example, we talk to two of those people who are like two separate people, but we work, even though it's one firm, we schedule meetings with both of them separately to see how they like it, how do they not like it. So with one of them is using our product left and right, one of them isn't. So we're like, okay, how do we shift this? Because it seems like you're not liking it as much. Maybe your problems are different, or maybe you see it differently. And you can't always aim for perfection, but you at least have to really understand what's the problem. Like, why are they not using it?
I saw you had a post the other day, mentioned you were in kickboxing, and I'm a martial artist. Yeah, don't spray your coffee out there. And one of the things, you know, in Muay Thai Sudo, they never had a black belt. You could get to navy blue, and the thought was you could never really get to perfection, right? So you were close, but never quite there. So, well, this is great. I mean, you talked a little bit about ideal users. If somebody's listened to our interview here, and then at the end they're really interested, but they're wondering, is this product right for me? How would you kind of define your ideal customer? Like, who gets the most value from your product? Because I imagine if you're an advisor that only has, you know, one piece of advertising a quarter, probably not a lot of value, right? Yeah. So tell us kind of like, who's an ideal user for you? Like, what's the company look like? A little bit like that. See,
the ideal user I talk with currently is when they have 50 to 1,000 employees.
Okay.
The AUM varies, you know, anywhere from literally 1 billion AUM to right now the largest is, I believe, 72. Anybody that's SEC or FINRA registrant usually tends to benefit from this the most, just due to the regulations, and the product we've built is very tuned for them specifically right now, the base product. We do run tests with, let's say, even an FCA regulated firm in the UK, but that's on a test level. The firms that are leading in terms of looking at compliance as a competitive advantage has been usually one of our biggest success factors. The firms that are either growing or downsizing. What we're competing with essentially is skilled human labor. Right?
Sure.
So skilled human
consultants.
Yeah, so if you're downsizing, if you're letting go of your people, then you want to have one reviewer that does this job as it was and maintain that. Makes sense. If you're growing, then you can not, instead of hiring like 5 more people, then you can have this. Or you can allocate your already the people you have on some of the tasks. But what I found that doesn't usually work is like people when they have, 5 people and they're not necessarily growing, even though they have a huge volume, they might not care as much because the firm is very much stagnant. So
yeah, they're kind of in a steady state and they don't want to upset, it's not broke, so why fix it, right?
Yeah, like you save hours of, let's say, save 50 hours per month of, let's say, each compliance officer. What are they going to do with those hours? So like so they're like, why am I paying extra to save those hours? If they know what are they going to do with those hours, then they would love to save those review hours. The features are, as I mentioned, it'll be anybody that's dealing with a lot of promissory language, with DDQs, with quarterly, reports, with pitch decks that needs to be, make sure disclosures are added, or check for performance, cherry picking. Those are the features. But in the sense of like just review aspect, that would be the major clients that we work with right now.
I guess any closing thoughts or anything else you want to share with our listeners before we sign off?
Thanks for having me. This is cool. I'm very excited about the future of AI. I think even though I talk about hours, and I think that's just because that's the obvious one that you can prove, our vision is entirely about making compliance really a big part of the business that makes it just easier for everybody to be compliant, instead of having these as like after the fact that you've done this, after the fact that you created something, whereas like compliance is sitting in the role of actually leading how you should be turning left and right. Like business is the speed and direction, but then some directions are just not allowed. Now imagine before you turn those directions, before you actually even think about them, compliance tells you like, yeah, okay, we shouldn't turn those. That's our big vision. And I think a lot of AI companies focusing on AI as a saving hours is an immediate thing only. And where it's going to go is that the cultures of our work, how we will see, is based on people actually using these products and AI founders like myself to innovate and really think about what's the actual vision, what's going to make the world a better place.
It's taking what has been a linear process where compliance is on the back end, and almost this tool is like a vehicle to embed them in the business so that it's not so much a linear process. It's just right in the middle of everything. It's during the iteration and creativity and development phase. So that's cool. That's a neat way to think about it. Well, I appreciate your time today, Mamal. Look forward to chatting with you. Good luck with everything. If anybody wants to reach out to you, what's the best way to contact you?
LinkedIn could be on our website. If they would want to, book a demo call, they can immediately book a demo call. My calendar's on our website as well. So governGPT.ai.com, both work.
Perfect. And we'll drop that into the comments and the notes here. So thanks again. Enjoy your weekend.
Thanks so much. You as well.